in turn that you respect, we ask for your respect as we proceed with the business of this committee today. It is the intention of this committee to proceed with this hearing without disruptions. If a disruption occurs, listen up, a Capitol Police officer will go up to the individual, instruct that they cease demonstrations. If the individual does cease, no action will be taken. However, if the person does not cease, you will be asked to leave. We are grateful for your presence here today and your cooperation, and we want to move this hearing along quickly. And every time I have to stop and the police have to address issues like that, that just slows us up. I would also remind all members to avoid engaging in any adverse personal references. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Today, the committee is examining the Trump administration's inhumane policy of separating children from their parents at the border and the dangerous conditions in which they are being held. Last Friday, we issued a staff report summarizing data on children who were separated from their families by the Trump administration. This report was based on information that we forced the Trump administration to produce to the committee pursuant to bipartisan subpoenas after they refused to provide it voluntarily for months. The report found that the administration's child separation policy was more harmful, more traumatic, and more chaotic than previously known. The report also describes specific case studies of 10 children who were separated by the Trump administration, including several who were under the age of 2. We sent our report to the department last week, and we will be asking our witness about these children this morning. Today, we will hear from Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Kevin McAleenan. He was originally invited to testify at our hearing last week, but he asked for that appearance to be postponed until today. We accommodated his request, and we thank you for being here today. Mr. McAleenan is one of the key architects of the Trump administration's child separation policy. Last April, he sent a memo to Secretary Nielsen explaining how they could, and I quote, direct the separation of parents or legal guardians and minors held in immigration detention, end of quote. He also recommended going forward with this policy, and she agreed. They separated thousands and thousands of children from their parents under this policy until public outrage and a federal court forced them to stop. Mr. McAleenan and other senior administration officials admitted that one of their purposes of separating children from their families was to deter immigrants and asylum seekers. General Kelly said this. Attorney General Sessions said this, and Mr. McAleenan admitted as much in an interview last June when he said, and I quote, the intent, unquote, of the policy to, and I quote, policy to dissuade crossing between ports of entry, end of quote. Tragically, under Mr. McAleenan's leadership, the Trump administration failed to track separated children and their families so they could be reunited. Mr. McAleenan has claimed that the administration, and I quote, kept very careful records when the relationships between parents and children. But that is not accurate. Our committee has now obtained data under subpoena showing a chaotic system in which children and parents were repeatedly moved to multiple facilities, in which parents were repeatedly deported without any idea of where their children were. Our findings are corroborated by multiple reports from the Independent Inspectors General and the Government Accountability Office, which concluded that the Trump administration made no serious effort to track separated children and had no plan to reunify them. Finally, while Mr. McAleenan has acknowledged overcrowding at the detention centers, he has claimed publicly that the reports of filthy and dangerous conditions are, quote, unsubstantiated, end of quote. This is simply not accurate. Last week, we heard testimony from the IGs that substantiated these reports in a graphic way, and they provided photographic evidence as well. The administration wants to blame Democrats for this crisis, but it is the Trump administration's own policies that are causing these problems. It was the Trump administration that implemented the, quote, zero tolerance policy, end of quote, separated thousands of children and increased the number of people in detention. It was the Trump administration that canceled effective policies from the last administration that reduced unnecessary detentions. It was the Trump administration that shut down the Family Case Management Program, in which social workers help migrant families find attorneys and navigate the court system with a 99% success rate for attending court appearances and check-ins with ICE. It was the Trump administration that ended the Central American Minors Program, which allowed children fleeing Central American countries with a relative in the United States to apply for asylum from their home countries. These were all policy decisions made by the Trump administration. They all increased the number of people being held and unnecessarily detained. And they all contributed to the conditions we are now witnessing. The damage the Trump administration has inflicted and is continuing to inflict will impact these children for the rest of their lives. As I've said, when we are dealing with children, it's not the deed, it's the memory. It is the memory that will haunt them until they die. Today's hearing is one more step in our committee's effort to determine the scope of this damage and begin to address it. And with that, I yield to the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Jordan.
The President says there's a crisis, asked for $4.5 billion. The Democrats said it's fake, it's contrived, it's manufactured, it's not a real crisis. Then the real crisis gets even worse. What do the Democrats do? They blame the President of the United States, and they blame the hardworking people who work for Mr. McAleenan on the border. When everyone knows what has to be done, everyone knows this. Got to fix the asylum law, got to fix the Flores decision, you got to build a border security wall. And frankly, what would also help is if folks on the left would quit saying some of the crazy things they're saying that I think incentivize more people to come and create this crisis that everyone acknowledged a long, long time ago except Democrats in Congress. I want to welcome our witness today, Secretary McAleenan. Thank him for his service to our nation at DHS, both during the Obama administration and the Trump administration. There's been a lot of talk from Democrats on this committee about the border crisis, and I hope that Secretary McAleenan will offer some facts and real perspective learned from his years of serving our country and helping secure our border. Last week, this committee held a hearing entitled Kids in Cages. The next day, Judiciary Committee Chairman Nadler accused Customs and Border Patrol of committing, quote, negligent homicide. The chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, the storied history of that committee told the people who work for this individual, who work for Secretary McAleenan, quote, negligent homicide. And just yesterday, he said another thing. Said CBP was engaged in torture. This rhetoric is wrong, it's despicable, and does nothing to fix the problem. After months of calling this a fake crisis, Democrats have now changed their tune. Make no mistake, the Democrats have only changed their tune because the facts simply cannot be ignored anymore. In fiscal year 2019, more than 688,000 illegal aliens, including nearly 133,000 in May 2019 alone, were apprehended between ports of entry along the southwest border, an increase of approximately 80,000 just since October of 2018. And while historically most immigrants were single adult males, 72% of all border enforcement actions in the last month were related to unaccompanied alien children and family units. So what do Democrats do when they have to acknowledge a problem that doesn't align with their politics? They look for someone to blame. Who else but the President of the United States and the hardworking men and women who work tirelessly every day trying to secure our border? The comments from Democrats in Congress, I think, only serve to demean the public service of our brave Border Patrol employees and, frankly, and this is important, to spark unnecessary outrage. Think about what we've heard from them. Abolish ICE. Abolish DHS, the entire department. Walls are immoral, the Speaker of the House said, even though there's a wall in her state. Non-citizens should be able to vote. Taxpayers should finance health care for all illegals. Concentration camps, they've called detention facilities concentration camps. Earlier this week, self-proclaimed member of Antifa showed up at an ICE detention center outside of Seattle, set cars on fire, and attempted to burn down the building. In his written manifesto, this Antifa member wrote that he felt it was necessary to take action against these, quote, concentration camps. Not one single so-called cage has been constructed by the Trump administration. Not one. During the presidency of Barack Obama, we didn't see outrage from the Democrats then. We didn't see prominent Democrat members of Congress condemning the, quote, concentration camps and, quote, torture then. Again, President Trump has not built a single cage. The cages you see in the news and on Twitter were constructed by President Obama's administration. In fact, the only thing the Trump administration has used chain link fence for is one temporary facility through which immigrants pass when they initially come and they're getting screened. The detention facilities that the Trump administration built are all air-conditioned, have fresh water, and supplies and folks trained to administer health care and those supplies. You would never know that and listen to the Democrats. After months of the administration highlighting the crisis at the border and making urgent calls for more funding, it wasn't until just before July 4th that House Democrats finally agreed to pass the $4.6 billion emergency border funding bill to provide some resources needed at the border. And despite the size and scope of the crisis, some Democrats still choose not to support this bill, choosing instead to play politics with the border rather than work on the solutions that we all know need to happen. Fabricating stories of cruelty and besmirching the hardworking civil servants protecting the border and providing humanitarian assistance does nothing to help solve the problem. Putting a Band-Aid over the border crisis does not fix the root causes. Democrats are serious. If they're serious about solving the border crisis, they must address, as I said before, the Flores settlement agreement, asylum loopholes, and the other laws and court decisions that incentivize aliens to make the dangerous journey to the United States. Most of all, they must stop obstructing the border security wall. This is one of the greatest challenges of our time, and frankly, it's getting worse by the day. I look forward to hearing from Secretary McAleenan, and as always, we stand ready to work with our Democrat colleagues to address the root causes, the real causes of this crisis at the southern border. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Before we move forward, let me say to the committee, I want to first of all thank Mr. Meadows for working hard with us to make this hearing happen in the majority. I really appreciate that very much. And the other thing is that we will go all the way up until the call of the vote, which is going to be at approximately 10:45, and then we will come back. And we will come back as soon after, I think we have 3 votes, as soon after that as we possibly can, but look at your iPhones to see exactly what, I'll let the staff know exactly the time, but I guarantee you it'll be as soon after that as we possibly can make it. And with that, now I would like to welcome our witness, the Honorable Kevin McAleenan, Acting Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. If you would please rise and raise your right hand, I will begin to swear you in. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Let the record show that the witness answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You may be seated. Secretary, the microphones are very sensitive, so please speak directly into them. And without objection, your written statement will be made a part of the record. With that, Mr. Secretary, you are now recognized to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the border security and humanitarian crisis, our efforts to mitigate it, and the continued support we need from Congress to address the underlying causes. I also intend to provide a much-needed account of the extraordinary humanitarian actions of men and women of the Department of Homeland Security, and especially U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the United States Border Patrol, have taken this year to protect migrants in our custody while securing our border and enforcing our nation's immigration laws. As I have testified and warned publicly dozens of times this year and last, we are facing an unprecedented crisis at the border. U.S. Customs and Border Protection has apprehended or encountered, as we sit here today, over 800,000 migrants crossing our border from Mexico since October 1st, over 90% of whom crossed illegally between ports of entry. Over 450,000 of these apprehensions and encounters were members of family units, and over 80,000 were unaccompanied children. Combined, that means over 300,000 children have entered our custody since October 1st. That's almost as many as the total apprehensions in fiscal year 17. These numbers are staggering, unprecedented, and have challenged and overwhelmed every aspect of our border and immigration enforcement system. And we have been warning about and asking for congressional action to address this crisis for well over a year. I first publicly referred to the southwest border as in a state of crisis a year ago yesterday. Since that time, I and CBP leaders have warned of the border security and humanitarian challenges in more than 100 briefings and meetings on the Hill, more than 15 official congressional hearings, more than 55 congressional delegations to the southwest border, 3 major press conferences, and more than 50 television appearances. On March 27th of this year, I went to El Paso sector and declared that the breaking point in our immigration system had arrived and that CBP was facing unprecedented humanitarian challenges. On June 10th, nearly 40 days after we asked Congress for emergency funding, and the same week that the DHS Inspector General was inspecting border facilities, I was explicit about the seriousness of the situation at the border on CNN, and I went well beyond the Inspector General's statements. I said our facilities are overcrowded. No American should be comfortable with children in a police station for days on end. It is not an appropriate setting for kids. It took another 2.5 weeks for Congress to vote on the emergency supplemental. Despite the scale of the challenge we face and the failure to enact legislation that would have prevented and could still end this crisis, DHS has made significant strides in its efforts to secure the border and to better protect the health and safety of migrants in our custody. Since January 2019, the DHS team has delivered over 6 million meals, conducted 400,000 medical health interviews, and completed more than 80,000 medical assessments for individuals in CBP custody. We've taken more than 21,000 sick or injured migrants to hospitals and conducted medical transportation or stood hospital watch for over 250,000 hours. With support from the U.S. Coast Guard, Public Health Service Commission Corps, and expanded contracts, we now have over 200 medical professionals embedded in border facilities, screening migrants upon arrival and providing critical triage capabilities, a 10-fold increase from January 1st. Combined with our 2,300 agents and officers who are trained emergency medical technicians and paramedics, I am confident that no law enforcement agency in the world is providing more critical life-saving care or medical support than U.S. Customs and Border Protection. On the facilities front, with humanitarian funding we requested in the FY19 budget and received finally in the supplemental, CBP professionals have constructed, outfitted, and staffed 4 new facilities to enhance the conditions in which individuals are held while in custody, with 2 more anticipated by the end of July. These facilities are targeted at reducing overcrowding and improving conditions at the border. More recently, 2 critical efforts are starting to make an impact, and we are seeing progress in reducing border flows and lowering in-custody numbers for the first time this fiscal year. Thanks to President Trump's direct engagement, we entered into an agreement with Mexico in early June to address the migration flows that is making a dramatic impact, a 28% reduction in border crossings in June. The other key factor allowing us to make progress is the care and custody of migrants at the border is the receipt 3 weeks ago of the emergency supplemental requested by the administration on May 1st. These funds are being directly and immediately applied to create temporary facilities to reduce overcrowding and improve conditions for all demographics at the border, expand medical care, provide more hot meals, improve transportation, and ensure adequate supplies at all border stations and ports of entry. These efforts have reduced in-custody numbers at the border from a high of almost 20,000 in June to under 10,000 yesterday afternoon. For unaccompanied children, Health and Human Services now has adequate bed space. We've reduced from 2,700 kids at the border to under 350 yesterday afternoon, with an average of fewer than 35 hours in CBP custody. And throughout this period, the men and women of DHS have served with vigilance and compassion. But make no mistake, the border flows and the custody situation remain beyond crisis levels. We are still seeing 2,500 crossings a day, mostly families. To continue to mitigate this, we're pursuing a multifaceted strategy that addresses the regional flows of migration at their source by expanding our partnership efforts with Central American governments to attack criminal organizations and improve security while fostering economic development and growth. Fundamentally, however, a durable solution to this crisis lies with Congress, with targeted changes to our immigration laws that we need to enhance the integrity of our immigration system and eliminate the gaps in our legal framework that incentivize families and children to take this dangerous journey. I will work with any member willing to discuss the problem and solutions and invite you to see the situation for yourself at the border. If I could indulge one more minute, Mr. Chairman.
You may, please.
Part of the stated purpose for this hearing is for the committee to receive testimony regarding increased immigration prosecutions last year under the so-called zero-tolerance problem and how the prosecution of adults crossing the border in violation of our immigration laws impacted families and children. This initiative resulted in an increase in prosecutions for violations of Section 1325 of the Immigration and Nationality Act from 20% to 50% and included all amenable adults, even those crossing our border unlawfully with children. These prosecutions, as all criminal prosecutions do, resulted in temporary separations of parents and children. This practice lasted 6 weeks, ended 13 months ago, and has been the subject of ongoing litigation, multiple congressional hearings, committee and inspector general reports, and hundreds of media stories. I have personally testified in a number of these hearings and in several media appearances and answered questions about it. I have acknowledged that this initiative, while well-intended, lost the public trust and that President Trump was right to end it. Under current practice governed by both executive and court orders along with operational guidance, separations of parents and guardians and the children they cross with are rare and are undertaken in the best interest and safety of welfare of the child. In closing, I feel compelled to address current public rhetoric surrounding the ongoing border security and humanitarian crisis. The incendiary and overwrought attacks on the men and women securing our border and enforcing the immigration laws in the interior are unwarranted and damaging. The demonization of law enforcement professionals, U.S. Border Patrol agents, CBP and ICE officers from all racial and ethnic backgrounds, from all faiths and callings, who have chosen a career about protecting others must stop. These false and overheated attacks are not helping to resolve the crisis. Indeed, they diminish the public's understanding and cloud its perception of what is happening. We need, Mr. Chairman, to regain our balance. We need to understand what is incentivizing and driving migrants to put themselves in the hands of dangerous smugglers and embark on this perilous journey to our border in order to have a real discussion on how to solve the problem. I hope that this hearing today can be a step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we, before we go to Mr. Raskin, can we move those signs, please? Thank you. The audience is trying to see. Thank you very much. And all the members, by the way, have what the signs say, so that's the most important thing. Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, the policy of separating children from their parents has shocked the conscience of our nation. So I want to go to the point that you closed with. You testified in the Senate that child separations are now, quote, extraordinarily rare and, quote, for the safety of the child. You told the Senate Judiciary Committee, quote, "We're talking about examples of a parent wanted for murder, a parent who's had a stroke and needs to be taken to the emergency room. But the facts that we've learned on the ground seem contrary to that reassuring picture." Last week, HHS IG official Ann Maxwell told us that her office saw cases in which the Department of Homeland Security separated children based on the parent's criminal history, including, for example, a prior charge of marijuana possession. Mr. Secretary, does a parent's prior charge for marijuana possession justify taking his or her child away?
So I want to start with the rare portion of this. Fewer than 1,000 juveniles have been separated from their parents crossing the border this fiscal year. That's with 450,000 crossings of family units. This is carefully governed by policy and by court order that needs to have a criminal background or issue, as you referenced, potential communicable disease or medical emergency, or risk of abuse or neglect from the parent to the child. This is in the interest of the child. It's carefully governed, it's overseen by a supervisor, and those decisions are made. And criminal history, yes, is a factor if there's an extraditable warrant or a prosecution for another offense.
Okay, and so do you think that a prior charge of marijuana possession justifies taking children away from the parent?
It depends on the totality of the individual case. It's kind of hard
If there
to
were
speculate
nothing
about
else,
a
if there were no other
hypothetical.
factors.
I'd have to look at the kind of case
Okay,
you referenced.
according to recently released HHS information on about 3,000 child separation cases, the large majority of them are labeled as taking place based on a parent's criminal history, which could include prosecution's charges or mere allegations of past crimes based on unsubstantiated information shared by foreign governments. So I want to be clear about this. Are separations taking place based on unsubstantiated evidence regarding suspected criminal backgrounds without criminal convictions?
So when we have an allegation of a serious crime that we're concerned about, especially if it's from a U.S. jurisdiction, that would be cause to consider separation of that case. We also partner with foreign governments. We work closely with law enforcement in Central America and in Mexico. And when we have referrals of criminal activity, a conviction, a indictment, or gang affiliation that's substantiated based on our partnership and our understanding of their mechanisms, their information collection procedures, we do take that into consideration in the safety of the child.
Let me take a case kind of like that. According to the Houston Chronicle, there was a 19-year-old Salvadoran woman identified as Maria who'd been abused by adult gang members for years. She was present at a gang fight, was taken into custody by the police, but was never charged with anything. But this interaction was enough for border agents to imprison her and to take away her 2-year-old son for more than 5 months. Do you think that was appropriate?
Again, I'd have to look at the specific factors in that case. I'm not sure that the Houston Chronicle has the same information that was provided by our foreign government partner. And that's, again, governed carefully by policy with discretion at the supervisory level in the field for making those decisions.
Okay, we've seen evidence to suggest that 3 sisters were taken away from their father in November of 2018, allegedly because he was HIV positive. Is that a proper basis upon which to remove children from their parents?
Again, you're referencing a number of specific cases that I do not have in front of me. I'm not sure if that was the only factor involved in that decision.
But let's assume it was. If they, I mean, just hypothetically speaking, then would you remove for that?
A simple fact of being HIV positive does not sound like that would meet the standard. There could be other complications medically that would have required a temporary separation.
Do you have written civil standards that you use in order to determine whether children should be removed from their parents?
We do have a policy and operational guidance consistent with the executive order and court order that's been sent out to the field and has been implemented.
Can you make that available to us?
Of course.
Last week, Jennifer Nagda of the Young Center testified before this committee. Her group is appointed by the Department of HHS to advocate for vulnerable children, including 120 recently separated children. On average, these kids, she testified, were 7 years old, and they were in custody for 115 days before seeing their parents. According to Ms. Nagda, the center found that separation was contrary to the best interests of the child in nearly every single case. Do you commit to this committee today and to Congress to have a policy where children will only be removed from their parents if there is a compelling reason to advance the child's own health and safety?
So we also have compelling reasons for criminal prosecutions that are also a relevant interest as understood by the court and expressed by the executive order. But I'd be happy to work with this committee to evaluate our procedures on separation, to hear Ms. Nagda's testimony about her concerns, and to consider ongoing how we can improve what we do.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cloud.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for being here, Secretary. In talking about the situation, the President said there may be some narrow circumstances in which there is a humanitarian or refugee status that a family might be eligible for. If that were the case, it would be better for them to apply in country rather than to make the various dangerous journey all the way up to Texas to make those same claims. Went on to say, but I also emphasized to my friends here that we have to deter a continuing influx of children putting themselves at great risk in families who are putting their children at great risk. And so I emphasize that within a legal framework and a humanitarian framework and proper due process, children who do not have proper claims and families with children who do not have proper claims at some point will be subject to repatriation to their home countries. Going on, I say this is not because we lack compassion, but because in addition to being a nation of immigrants, we are also a nation of laws. And if you have a disorderly and dangerous process of migration, that not only puts the children themselves at risk, but also calls into question the legal immigration process of those who are properly applying and trying to enter our country. Would you agree generally with this assessment?
I didn't hear you say who made that assessment, but yes, from what you read, I would agree with that.
It was President Obama 5 years ago. He went on to say that there have been a lot of press conferences about this, referring about this, and the time for we need action and less talk is what he said. And you mentioned all the different meetings that you've been in. He also went on to explain how the economic conditions, wanting a better life, did not fit in that narrow definition of asylum in that same press conference. Could you speak briefly to the magnet that is drawing migrants here?
Sure, and just one other comment on that, as the chairman raised in his opening statement, the Central American Minors Program ended. That was a program that provided a categorical parole for certain minors in Central America, and this administration has proposed in January in a letter from the OMB acting director to Congress on the budget deal, and again, working with Chairman Graham and the Senate Judiciary side on his legislation, technical assistance that would allow for a similar approach, applying for asylum, especially for unaccompanied children in country, closer to where they are, because we don't want them in the hands of smugglers coming to the border. So on the incentives, Ranking Member Jordan laid it out. The main incentive has been the fact that families all over the region, advertised by smugglers, fully internalized. We saw it on CBS News last night. A woman all the way from Venezuela said she knew if she brought her child, she would be released. Has been the fact that the Flores settlement does not allow us to do what we were able to do under President Obama and Secretary Johnson, which is detain families together through an expeditious, fair immigration proceeding. It took about 40 to 50 days on average. That resulted in a clear immigration decision from a judge, either a repatriation if there wasn't a valid immigration claim, or a determination that family would be allowed to stay. We're not able to do that anymore. That's why we see so many families coming. It's a direct response to that gap in the framework.
Right. Now, definitely this is Congress's job to act. It's our responsibility. We're supposed to fix it. So nothing is meant to, what I say is meant to take us away from that responsibility. But we sent you a letter a couple months ago highlighting 8 actions the administration could take. I wanted to touch on a couple of them in the time that I have left. One of them was training agents to do credible fear interviews. We got your response. You said I think by the end of this month we'll have 60 trained over the last couple months. But that is the limit in that this is a pilot program. Now, the idea of training agents to do credible fear interviews is that we wouldn't have that 2-year process. We could really solve this right at the beginning, as opposed to, this mass influx that we don't know what to do with these people. We could solve this almost at the point of entry. Why are we not doing more? I mean, there's thousands and thousands of agents at the border who could be trained to do this, and we're limiting this pilot program to 60.
So first of all, I agree strongly with the principle that we should be addressing those asylum claims at the border doing a credible fear assessment as soon as possible, and that training immigration officers, Border Patrol agents, ICRO, asylum officers are all technically immigration officers under the statute on those standards could help us increase the capacity and volume. What we're trying to do is balance it against the continuing crisis, the fact that we've got 40 to 60% of our agents doing processing, care, transport, hospital watch for migrants, not out on the line. So we need
Only
to
have like
balance.
10 more seconds if I could ask one more
Yeah,
question real quick.
please.
Work authorization. Could you explain the process of who all is getting work visas, why they're getting work visas, in the context of how many people that are crossing our border
Right.
end up actually having a legitimate claim to be here?
So in that context, what we're seeing is for asylum claims, 10 to 20% actually getting asylum at the end of a court process. Unfortunately, that takes years to happen. So we are seeing employment authorizations being issued by CIS. The acting director is looking again at that policy and seeing if we're applying it appropriately, given the context you offered.
Thank you. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Acting Secretary. Just want to read you a quote. There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats children. That was a quote from the late Nelson Mandela. Would you agree with that quote, the sentiments of that quote, Mr. McElhaney?
Tremendous respect for the late Nelson Mandela, and that's a powerful quote.
Are you a dad?
Yes, Congressman.
You got children. I do too. I have one. Mr. Secretary, last Friday, the committee released a staff report on the child separation policy. It summarized the data produced by you and other agencies under committee subpoenas, as referenced by the chairman. We provided you with a copy of that report last week, and we agreed to delay this hearing in the anticipation that you would review that report. That report included 10 case studies, not 100, not 1,000, and we identified specific children at your department's suggestion by number rather than by name, though we had the names. I want to ask you about one of those cases. I assume you looked at the report.
I've reviewed the report, but I'm not prepared to discuss in detail specific cases at this time.
Well, I am. There's a child identified in the report as child number 2. We have additional copies of the report, obviously, if you need to refer to them. The records we obtained from you and other agencies show that this child is a baby boy from Honduras who was just 8 months old when he arrived with his dad at the Texas border in May of last year. He was 8 months old. He was taken away from his father and sent to a facility in Arizona. He then spent 6 months in that facility. He had his first birthday there. He spent half of his life without his dad in the custody of U.S. officials. Meanwhile, his dad was transported to 3 different ICE facilities and then ultimately deported after 2 months. Mr. Acting Secretary, why was a child of 8 months held for 6 months while his dad was deported 2 months later?
So, Congressman, if the case you're referring to happened in May of 2018,
Yes, sir.
Do you have the date? Do you have the date?
The actual date in May?
Yes.
We can get it to you.
Okay. And again, we'd be happy to go back over these specific cases with you and members of your staff as appropriate. But what I can tell you is that when we implemented the zero tolerance protocols to increase prosecution of amenable adults, including those arriving with children, I specifically directed, and the Chief of the Border Patrol echoed, that that would not include parents traveling with children under 5. So when we've gone back and looked at the cases, and there were a few dozen of separations during that time frame, we've determined that there were other reasons that would comply with the current executive order or court order for separations of children under 5 that occurred during the zero tolerance period. So if this is in that period,
All right,
I would imagine there's...
I'm running out of time. I just want to clarify what you said. Forgive me for interrupting, but I want to make sure I understand what you said. Normally, you're saying your policy would not have allowed this. Something must have happened that made an exception to your normal practice. Is that what I understand?
Basically, yes. I mean, this was during the zero tolerance period. If it was after May 7th or so, if it was before then, it would have been under historical approaches. In either case, there must have been another issue with the adult or a concern that we want to follow up on.
Let's say there was,
Okay.
in theory. But isn't there something wrong with deporting the dad and keeping the infant? I mean, don't we have a tracking system in place?
Sure.
That would have caught that and said, hey, we gotta link these two up. That's a dad like you
Right.
with his child, a baby, 8 months old.
By ICE policy, if they're going to remove an adult who arrived with the child, it is up to that adult to choose whether the child should be repatriated with them.
I got one more question for you. On the Erin Burnett show, the acting director of USCIS, Virginian, Mr. Cuccinelli, actually blamed the father for the death of himself and his daughter crossing the Rio Grande. It turned out, of course, that Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez, who left El Salvador on April 3rd, actually his daughter had jumped into the river and he tried to rescue her. Mr. Cuccinelli said, and I'll end in this, that father didn't want to wait to go into the asylum process, so he decided to cross the river, and therefore it was his fault. Do you share that sentiment? Is that the philosophy of your department?
I think what happened to Oscar and Valeria is a tragedy. I think they deserve better. They deserve a legal framework in our country that doesn't incentivize unlawful crossing, and they deserve an opportunity to apply for protections if they warrant them as close to home as possible.
And you're a dad, I'm a dad. Just one final point, Mr.
Gentleman's
Chairman.
time has expired. I'm sorry.
You would have jumped in the river to help your daughter too, right?
You may answer the question.
Of course, Congressman.
Thank you.
Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Jordan. And thank you very much for being here today. In April, I took a trip with my colleagues to Guatemala to see firsthand the results of human trafficking and abuse of women that occur in the country. I saw with my own eyes the devastating impacts that human trafficking has on the young girls. And I know that this same trafficking is occurring at the border, our border. We need real solutions to act swiftly to address the root causes of this issue. Mr. McAleenan, I have a lot of questions, so try to keep your answers short enough that I can get to them all. Nobody wants children to be separated from their parents, and we all want to ensure that children are treated with dignity and housed comfortably. What are the factors a Border Patrol agent uses, what he goes through in order to assess these illegal family units when they arrive?
So by and large, the vast majority, well over 99% or 98% of children that arrive with parents are kept together in the process. The Border Patrol agent or CBP officer encountering that family will undertake the analysis under the criteria in the President's Executive Order from June 20th of 2018 and the Miss L Court Order, which are consistent with prior policy that it's in the interest of the safety and welfare of the child. And cases are, again, prosecution for a criminal offense or serious criminal history, abuse or neglect expressed by that parent or the child where we have a concern, or a medical emergency. Those are the main indicators of a potential separation.
How many children's lives have been saved by the Border Patrol?
So I think that's a really important question. We make over 4,000 rescues a year. Already in the first 9 months of this fiscal year, the U.S. Border Patrol has made 3,800 rescues. Their rescues on the river have gone up tenfold. We're seeing agents almost every day dive into the water with their full equipment on to try to rescue families crossing in the water. It's high water this time of year, and it's very dangerous. So 3,800 rescues so far this year.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. What is the average size of migrant groups that the Border Patrol is encountering between the ports of entry? And how is that impacting the Border Patrol's operations?
Yeah, this year has been unlike any other we've seen in our history, with well over 150 large groups of more than 100 migrants crossing together. We peaked with a group of 1,036 migrants crossing as one group, all from Central America. 900 plus of them were family units. But since Mexico has started to do their interdiction operations, address the transportation networks on their highways, we've seen a dramatic drop. We've only had 4 large groups since the start of Mexico's operations and 0 in July to date.
Wonderful. How is it the policy for separating children from their parents? What do you use, except in the zero tolerance? What's different in this administration and past administrations?
Right now, our policy is identical to what we were doing before the zero tolerance practice that ended over a year ago.
The same?
Yes.
Okay. In fiscal year 2019, the Department of Homeland Security identified nearly 5,500 migrants presenting as family units that turned out to be fraudulent. Why would adults use children to help them cross the border?
Unfortunately, we see that all too often now. That's been a big focus this year, to try to identify those adults that are bringing children with them that are not their own, to try to take advantage of what they perceive as a loophole in our law that would allow them to be released in the United States. We've had egregious cases, including a 51-year-old man who bought a 6-month-old child for $80 in Guatemala, and admitted that when confronted with a DNA test by a Homeland Security Investigations agent conducting a pilot at one of our border stations.
How has the Flores settlement impeded our ability to enforce the law?
It's prevented us from getting immigration results from judges that can be effectuated.
At what point would a child be separated from the adult they arrived with?
At what point? It would depend on when an issue was identified. For instance, we unfortunately had a 15-year-old girl a few months ago tell us on her second day in custody that her father had raped her the night before they crossed the river. And so she was immediately separated and taken care of and sent to Health and Human Services as a result.
So it's for safety, isn't it?
Correct.
If a family unit is housed together, how are they housed? Are they in a room with other families?
Yes, we separate families generally by demographic and gender, so male head of household families with other male head of household families, same for female head of household families. The age of the kids is also a factor. We try to just keep people in the safest groups possible during the short time they're at the border.
But what if one of the...
Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Christian Morphy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Acting Secretary, for coming in. Secretary McAleenan, 2 weeks ago on July 3rd, my colleague, Congressman Chuy Garcia, and I wrote you a letter requesting that you provide a plan within 14 days for how you will utilize the $1.34 billion in emergency supplemental funding provided to DHS to address the border situation. I have not received a response. Mr. Chairman, without objection, I'd like to enter this letter into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. McAleenan, has DHS begun receiving the emergency humanitarian funds provided by Congress and signed by the President on July 1st?
Of course, and I can tell you that we were already acting in hopes of receiving that funding before the supplemental was enacted.
What is the status of the plan for using the funding as Congress intended? I presume there is a plan.
Sure, of course. About half of the funding is dedicated to enhanced facilities, temporary facilities at the border where we can provide additional space, reduce overcrowding, and improve the care of those that are in custody of CBP during their short stay at the border. We've already erected 4 temporary soft-sided facilities, 2 in South Texas, 2 in El Paso, and by the end of this month, we'll have another 4,500 spaces online and an additional set of temporary facilities in those 2 locations as well.
So half of the money is allocated for that purpose. What's the other half?
So the rest of it covers a range of issues, from paying for the surge force of agents and officers that's down there helping our Border Patrol agents with the humanitarian mission, their temporary deployment. It adds to our medical contracts so that we can provide embedded medical professionals, certified medical professionals in our facilities. It augments our ability to pay for supplies and food. I referenced the 6 million meals that we provided folks in our custody since
So just to be clear,
October 1st.
Sorry, just to be clear, all this money is being used for the humanitarian efforts
That's
and
correct.
not for any interior ICE deportation efforts or other enforcement actions, correct?
Well, that's how it was appropriated, but I want to be clear, Congressman, that creates a challenge because we asked for funding for ICE single adult beds. and it was not granted. So those single adults are waiting at the border for placement with ICE. And so
I understand, sir. But just to be clear, that is how the money was funded, so that's how we expect it to be used.
That's correct.
And for purposes of our letter, Chuy Garcia's and my letter, we expect a response. How the money is going to be spent and on what timeline. It has to be transparent so we can actually measure your efforts against your plan. Do I have your assurance we'll receive that plan?
We're transparent to our oversight on how we're spending money that's appropriated by Congress, and will continue to be.
Do we have your assurance that you'll respond to the letter with the information requested?
We'll respond to all appropriate requests from Congress.
Will you respond to our letter on July 3rd?
I'd be happy to come talk to you about the plan. I haven't seen the letter. I'll talk to my staff about where it is in the process.
Okay, I expect a response, sir. Mr. McAleenan, you served as CBP Commissioner prior to your current role at the helm of DHS. According to CBP, 70 current or former employees are now under investigation for posting racist, sexist, and other inappropriate comments about migrants and members of Congress to a quote-unquote secret Facebook group for Border Patrol agents with over 9,500 members. Are you aware of this secret group, sir?
I've been made aware, yes.
Were you a member of that group?
No.
Is Mark Morgan a current or former member of that group?
I don't know, but I don't believe so.
Sir, what are the efforts to investigate those particular comments and the members of that group?
Yeah, so our CBP's Office of Professional Responsibility initiated an investigation within hours of those allegations coming to light. As you noted, they've already placed a number of individuals under investigation. They've put several on administrative duties. They've issued cease and desist letters, and they're moving very quickly to hold people accountable for conduct that doesn't meet our standards.
When will we receive a report on the results of that investigation?
So again, it's proceeding very aggressively. I would say probably this month or early next month we'll be able to update on the results of those investigations.
Okay, we find this conduct extremely troubling and expect to receive that report. And would you be willing to come back in to discuss that report?
Certainly, or CBP will come and brief it appropriately.
Sir, last question, which is this. The zero tolerance policy that was adopted, how do you define zero tolerance under this administration with regard to immigration policies?
Consistent with the President's executive order from January 25th, 2017, that we would no longer have categorical exceptions to enforcement of immigration law, one, and two, under the Attorney General's April 6th letter, which was to have all 1325 unlawful entry cases be submitted, that was the goal, submitted for prosecution by DOJ.
I thought you were finished. Please finish.
During zero tolerance, the prosecutions increased from about 20% of amenable adults to 50% of amenable adults by eliminating that categorical exception.
Thank you very much. Mr. Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question in response to my colleague's questioning just now. Is it true that $0 are included in the supplemental that just passed for ICE detention for single or family units?
That's correct.
Right, and isn't that part of the problem?
It is.
Right, and wasn't it purposeful by my Democrat colleagues?
I assume that they did not want to fund ICE beds, but what I'm trying to emphasize is the impact it has on adults waiting at the border.
But it's not just a humanitarian crisis, is it? We have a crisis of national security, overstretched resources, endangerment of American citizens, endangerment of Texas communities, and endangerment of migrants along the journey at the hands of cartels, is it not?
It's also a border security crisis.
The truth is that dangerous cartels, particularly the Gulf cartels, Reynosa faction, the CDN of Los Zetas, and the Sinaloas, are massively profiting by moving people through Mexico to the United States, correct?
Yes, $3 billion plus a year.
The poster behind me is a poster that shows prices for moving people through Mexico and to the United States. And so do you agree that it is true that certain dangerous cartels have an entire business model designed to exploit American laws for profit, to move human beings for profit, and that they charge money per person as depicted in this chart?
Yes, I met a family from Honduras yesterday that explained they paid $10,000 to come across.
Do you agree that they use children as a ticket for profit to come to the United States?
Yes.
Now let's look at the numbers quickly. How many people have come across the border and sought to be detained themselves, sought detention, or were apprehended? That number from October 1st to present is north of 700,000, correct?
It's north of 500,000. The single adults are not, by and large, turning themselves in.
Okay.
They're trying to evade capture, and embedded in that group, unfortunately, are gang members, criminals, and hardened smugglers.
And then if you include those that have been apprehended that didn't seek to be turned over, it's well over 700,000, correct?
Oh, combined, we're over 800,000.
And so then there are then those hundreds of thousands of people who crossed our border in that time who were not apprehended, correct?
There are, yes.
And is it not true that Border Patrol is overwhelmed? Is it not true that Border Patrol is dealing with housing migrants rather than policing the border?
When you have 40% of your agents doing housing, transportation, and care, the border is less secure.
Of those 800,000 that you just said, how many were UACs? Around 80,000?
Yes,
How many are single adults? 250,000 or so?
correct.
And of those, are they mostly male?
The single adults
single
are
adult?
predominantly male, yes.
How many were family units? Over 400,000?
450,000.
Of those, roughly 200,000 each of adults and children, about 50-50?
We're seeing about 1.1 because people know that a child is a very valuable
Right.
way to get into the U.S., so they're only bringing one child with them at a time now.
Are most of those family units now dispersed throughout the United States?
Yes.
For the most part, are these family units claiming asylum, or are they largely using a child as a ticket for catch and release?
The latter. We do see a number of asylum claims, but it's actually gone down this year from the peak of about 30% of those encounters claiming asylum.
Is it true that the issue of UACs could be largely solved with a fix to TVPRA and that this could be done on a single piece of paper?
Yes.
Is it true that we could largely solve the problem of family units rushing our border and then being caught and released by addressing the Flores settlement, an extension of that settlement by a Ninth Circuit judge on essentially a single piece of paper?
Yes, that was our experience in 2014 and 2015.
Is it true that with respect to the family unit problem, representing the majority of the surge across our border, that the Obama administration supported a solution to the Flores problem and that, again, we could solve it on a single piece of paper?
Yes.
Is it true that the Obama administration asked for $762 million for ICE to deal with the unaccompanied alien children problem in 2014, the surge where children were riding on the top of train cars?
Yeah, we all asked for additional appropriations at DHS to deal with the unaccompanied child surge, yes.
And does that amount seem correct, the $762 million?
That sounds like it's in the ballpark.
That is what I'm told. Is it true that the supplemental just passed only provided $200 million for ICE in response to a much larger crisis today, and that it came with significant restrictions on how it can be used?
That's correct.
To repeat again, $0, purposely $0 for ICE beds and ICE detention. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you anticipate that the Democrat-led House of Representatives will bring any of these solutions that could be done on one piece of paper to the floor for a vote this week?
Probably not this week, but I'm sure hopeful on a shared set of facts we can talk about real solutions.
So for Flores, TVPRA, or money for ICE, the things that we know would solve the problem and largely address the crisis, you are not anticipating that that will be brought to the floor of the House of Representatives this next week before we adjourn for the August recess?
I don't see any legislative action that would make that possible at this time.
Which begs the question why? Which begs the question why? And I'll tell you why. It is because my Democrat colleagues don't give a damn about our national security or the migrants coming here, and they prefer to use children as political props. Thank you. No more questions.
Thank you very much. As I said a little bit earlier when I opened, I think we need to be careful about the motives of our members, and that goes to both sides. With that, we now will hear from Ms. Spear.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
And let me hold up, Ms. Spear. The bells are rung. Ms. Spear will be the last person, and then we will go into recess. And as I said a little bit earlier, we will let you know exactly. We have 3 votes, I understand. And then, is it 3?
3, possibly 4.
3, possibly 4 votes. So I'm just letting you know. Ms. Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director. I was with 16 other colleagues at the border at McAllen and Brownsville last weekend. It's my 2nd trip to the border. Have you been there, sir?
Several dozen times.
All right. So this is familiar to you. Seeing families, mothers and children, caged with Mylar blankets.
Yes.
That's familiar to you. And is this familiar to you, too? This is what we saw at the processing center. 40 men in a cell that could probably, under normal circumstances, accommodate maybe 5. This man is putting his fingers up, showing that he has been there for 40 days and 40 nights without a shower and without being able to brush his teeth. And I confirmed that with the Border Patrol officers there. This would not be allowed as a kennel for dogs, yet that's how we're housing them. And you know the Sallyport is filled with yet another 400 or 500 men as well. It's unacceptable, and it has to change. We don't treat human beings like that. Now, I'm going to ask you to
Can I respond to those comments?
You can after I ask you this question. I want to ask you about a case study that is in our report that you've had the benefit of looking at. You've had it since last Friday. It's child number 3. He was 19 months old when he arrived from Honduras at the southern border in Texas with his father in April of 2018. He was taken from his father and transported to foster care in New York before being released to a sponsor 6 months later. During the time, the toddler's father was sent to ICE detention facilities in Texas, New Jersey, and New York before being released. Why was this 19-month-old baby taken from his father?
So first on the conditions. There's no one in this room that is warned more often or more stridently about the overcrowding and the conditions in our facilities than I have. So I'm very concerned about them. I've been asking Congress for help. We did not get the money for single adult beds that would allow us to move those adults out of our custody from Congress. So I just want to make that point very clear. Secondly, on this case, as I said to Congressman Connolly, I'd be happy to follow up on specific cases. I don't have the details on this case today. But what I explained as well
here's
is
the
that
problem. You've had this report since last Friday. You should have come prepared to answer these particular cases. So I'm wondering why you weren't able to do so.
So I've reviewed this report, and I've explained to Congressman Connolly our policy. I directed, and the Chief of the Border Patrol implemented during the period of zero tolerance, that we would not separate, we would not prosecute an adult that would result in a separation from their child if the child was under 5 years old. Okay, so if that happened, it was likely due to another issue in that adult's history or in the situation with that child that resulted in the separation. So I want to be clear on that.
We don't know then if the toddler was ever reunited with the father.
We do. I mean, the Miss L, we have lots of different ways to confirm this. And the Miss L court is reporting biweekly the results of their own class and the reunifications of that class. We also have the ability in our system to see which adults cross with which child and respond to that. So we can do a very specific response on this particular case.
Okay, so you will provide us with a specific response to the questions that we provide to you.
Yes.
Let me ask you this. One of the children that we met was an 8-year-old. His mother was dead. His father was elderly. He was brought here by his 25-year-old sister and was separated at the border. There was another young 16-year-old with an infant that has a mother in New York, but is going to not be reunited with her sponsor for as much as 60 days. Some of these cases are being handled in a way that doesn't recognize if you're a family unit, the family unit should be retained. And I want you to look at ways of improving the system. A 25-year-old sister and an 8-year-old child is a family unit, and they should not have been separated. This child now is homeless, parentless, and has lost his sibling. We can't treat people like this.
May I respond?
Yes.
So we've offered both to the Senate and House Judiciary Committees in their consideration of legislation to a modification to the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act that requires by law that a child arriving without a parent or guardian be considered unaccompanied, and the only option that we have at the border in that case is to transfer that child to Health and Human Services, where they make the decision on the best placement with the sponsor. We would like and be willing to discuss the opportunity to have more flexibility to adjust to the kind of cases you just referenced.
All right. I want to work with you on that.
Committee stands in recess into the members. We will reconvene a half an hour after the last vote begins, okay, on the floor. We stand